to make sure that there's actually a larva in there, because sometimes it's not. And so what will happen is this queen will emerge, and as soon as one of these emerges, they'll go and kill these other ones. So what you'll find sometimes if you're too late, you'll find one of them that has a circular cap, just like a lid that came off, and then all the other ones will have a hole ripped in the side. And what they've done is they've gone and killed them all off. And sometimes you can even see them, they'll sting her and throw her out of the hive, and she'll be laying in front of the hive. Usually they're goners anyway, but the swarm cells, these guys will actually emerge out, and then that queen will hang out in the hive until it's a nice warm day. So I was telling her that in the spring, if it's cold and wet like this, the first warm sunny day is just going to be swarm city. So sometimes I'll actually take a day off and just go driving around and watching the Facebook page, because there'll be 10 swarms in a day just on the Facebook page. Okay, so the other thing that people will call me about, they're a little concerned, is cells the cap cells that actually look really big. You know, they look funny. They're like, are these queen cells? You know, especially if they're down along the bottom. This is an example. So this is drone cells and worker cells. And you can kind of see the drones, they're almost too tall to fit in the comb. So they look like popcorn or something sticking out. And often they'll draw those a lot in the corners or on the bottom, or if there's a funny part of your frame or it got dented or something, they'll make a bunch of drone cells there. But sometimes they'll actually just make a patch of them side by side like that. I mean, typically they're down along here.
And does the queen decide how many drones get laid, or is that a worker thing like it is with the queen thing? Or?
Well, they'll certainly draw a drone comb when they're looking for it. But that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that one. It's a really good question. I know that there's something that the workers secrete. So when they get a lot of protein, a pollen patty, for example, will stimulate this. The workers secrete something that stimulates the building of more brood comb. And there may be something to that. So they've shown that if you protein starve a hive, the first thing to go is they skip making drones. And but if hive has enough protein, and I always take it as a good sign. If your hive is producing drones before everybody else is, it means your hive is getting better nutrition than everybody. They're kind of almost like a luxury for the hive, because they're not going to do any work for the hive, but they're out contributing genes to the local population. So I always take it as a good sign that you got a big batch of drone comb. Although people consider they're kind of freeloaders, so a lot of times they'll just cut that out and throw that away. But it's a good sign. So here's an example again of that. There's a patch. This, you might look at that and go, oh man, there's a whole bunch that didn't survive. But it's actually the oldest pupa, and they're actually starting to emerge. You can actually see one that's actually coming out. And it's like a whole zone. So that day, that queen was busy. And then the next day, she laid eggs in this section right here. And you can see it, the capping's kind of darkened with time. So you can kind of see this variation in the color. And there's another region right here, and then finally the lighter stuff around the side. And you kind of see this, they call it like a bullseye effect. And you'll see this kind of zone. And then so by the time these are completely cleaned out, these will start to emerge, and then she'll lay eggs in here again. So kind of, see, it's a self-propagating pattern. Here's an example on a top bar hive. And you can kind of see this one, these have all emerged out. There's another lighter pattern here. This you kind of go, oh man, what's going on here? But those are already filled with larvae again. This, on the other hand, is not such a good thing. So if you see this, it's actually almost like 50-50. That's a lot of dead brood. And there's two things that could be happening. Either the queen is just laying real spotty like that, she's really having a hard time cranking out eggs, or they're actually dying. And by the time you get to the cap brood stage, they're like, I don't know, was that 10 or 12 days into it? So there's a long time where they could have died. They could have died as eggs, she could have not laid the eggs. But what you can actually see is these are dying larvae. And that's actually a sign of some kind of brood disease. So they probably have European fall brood, or at worst, American fall brood. And you actually notice it's kind of hard to see, but some of these have honey in there as well. So they're dying early enough that they're just filling in the cells with honey. And the queen should be basically outpacing their ability to make comb. But in this case, they're actually running out of place to put the honey because there's not that much brood to take care of. So a lot of these things you just kind of learn from observation. If there's not a lot of brood to take care of, the nurse bees will get promoted to be foragers because there's nothing for them to do. They go out and forage, and a lot of times what you'll see is, oh, my hive is booming. They're collecting a ton of honey all of a sudden. And what it is, you killed your queen 2 weeks ago and you didn't notice it. And now basically all the nurse bees are getting converted into foragers. And sometimes even the commercial guys, if they want their bees to actually spend all their time pollinating and not taking care of young, what they'll do is they'll take all the brood away, put all the foragers in with empty honey supers, and they'll put them out into the field. Sometimes they'll even remove the queen. She just caused trouble. So here's another thing that you might expect throughout the year. So if the queen dies and they're unable to make a new queen, what will happen is the queen pheromone and the brood pheromone, so the young brood also secretes a pheromone that tells the workers, help, I need help. And if that brood pheromone goes away, what happens is some of the workers' ovaries will start to develop and they will actually start to lay eggs. And there's kind of a lot of misconceptions about this. All hives have a few worker bees that are laying eggs at all times. So there's probably 200 or 300 worker eggs laid per day. Their sisters sense that there's a queen there and they go in and kill them all off. And what it is it's a mechanism, so as soon as the queen dies, if the queen dies and there's no brood pheromone and no queen pheromone, the workers then, it's every girl for himself, or herself, and they start laying eggs. And they will take care of them and produce, these are actually drones. So they have a tendency to lay them in worker cells, and you can see they're actually having a hard time fitting the drone in there. And they tend to be real patchy because you can't even fit them side by side. And then they stick out like a sore thumb. So right in the middle of all this worker comb are all these little volcanoes. And those are drones. And those actually will be fertile drones. They'll fly out and mate, and that hive's genes will be transmitted even if there's no other bees. And sometimes I'll go open a hive in the middle of summer that someone hasn't looked at in a long time, and there'll be 20,000 drones and 500 frazzled worker bees trying to raise them all up. And basically the hive is dead. And whenever your drone population gets to be more than about a third, you can't really rescue this. So people will try and requeen them. And the queen just does not have enough attendants to kind of keep up with it. And often they will actually kill off the queen. So there's like a complicated interplay that goes on. It actually, once the queen is gone, like I said, it's every worker for herself. And then they start having competitions based on how related they are. And they kind of break off into little warlord things. It's a cool thing. But
is that sort of what the King of Thrones or the whole medieval soap operas we see these days based on the bee?
It's kind of is actually. So the really interesting thing in the genetics of bees, so the queen goes out and mates with 10 to 20 drones. And those drones are from all different hives and genetic backgrounds. And so your hive, you'll look at your hive and you'll see there's black bees and there's yellow bees and there's brown bees. And if you have a good eye, you can actually pick out about 8 or 10 kinds of bees. They actually have a different genetic background. Their mother is their full mother, but they're all stepsisters. And there's different groups, and what they've shown is these certain bees have a predisposition to be a forager, or a wax builder, or an undertaker, or there's actually raider bees. There's a mutation that will cause them to be basically aggressive bees, and they have a tendency to go out and rob other hives. And each hive kind of needs a certain proportion of each of these, but this is what is thought to explain the character of a hive. So you'll have one hive that's a little bit testy, but they're really productive. or this hive is really mellow but very productive. And they have different traits. And the breeders try and, they act like, well, these are purebred. But actually, there's a lot of mechanisms in the genetics of bees that prevent them from being ever purebred. So there's the problem with only mating once is there's a good chance for inbreeding unless you have a way to select for that. So
when they're producing queens, they raise the queens go off, they mate. How do the breeders, where do the queens, they come back to that same hive? How do they catch them after they've mated?
Yeah, so the queen, the virgin queen will fly out of her hive. She actually does what's called an orientation flight to find out where her box is. She goes out and mates, and they actually go pretty far. Sometimes they'll go 3 miles away, and then they come back to that same box, and they'll have thousands of breeder boxes in a field, and they come back to the same box every time. So they actually do. They don't have to catch them. That would be a real trick. Yeah. But they do. But the problem is, so they have a breeding yard where they'll have 100 hives that generate drones. But really, they need a lot of variation in there. Otherwise, it doesn't work out. So it's really hard to get a purebred strain of bees. So I kind of laugh at some of the descriptions they have on your bees. These are blah, 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 hybrids. They're all sort of hybrids. I mean, they tend to keep the strains apart from each other. You have a Carnolian yard or an Italian yard, but typically it's a mixture of many different strains. And the breeders will actually import Carnolians from other states just to keep feeding in some genetic diversity. So here's an example of what you'll see with the laying worker. Okay, so there's only supposed to be one egg in there, but the workers, since it's every girl for themselves, they just lay egg wherever. And then usually only one of these will survive. So the workers will go in and cull out all but one. And they discovered actually when they mark the eggs, it's the ones that you're related to. So they can somehow tell. But when you see something like this, even if there is a queen in the hive, it means there's workers that are just let loose. And the problem with this is these will all become drones, and it pretty rapidly will swamp out your hive with bees that aren't doing any work. Okay, so probably by now you know whether your queen is doing well. I mean, some people call it, open up their package and their queen was dead. That's easy to fix. Actually, the interesting thing is when you get a package and the queen is dead, sometimes what that means is there's a queen loose in the loose bees. And they recognize her as their queen because it probably came with the package, the bees that they shook, and they just went and killed the one in the cage. So while you probably still should call and get a queen to replace that, be careful just throwing her back into the mix. What you might do actually is split your package in half and put the queen in one and on the other, and you might actually find that one of the halves of bees is real aggressive towards your queen and the other one kind of cuddles and treats her nice. And what you've actually done is you have two queens. But say you find a hive that you were doing really well, and then you stepped and you heard a crunch and you looked down and that was the queen. There's two things you can do. If you knew that you killed the queen, you just saw her die, you could just rush on over, get a queen, put her in a cage in your hive, leave her in a cage for at least 48 hours because they're still not over their last queen. And then go ahead and release her. So never just throw a queen in a hive that you think is queenless. It's always a good idea to give them a waiting period regardless. The other thing you can do is wait till the next weekend or something and then look for queen cells. So they'll sense that the queen is dead and they'll go and make queen cells. And if you don't know if you killed the queen, just check in 5 or 6 days and you'll see capped queen cells. It's 7 days to cap actually. And if you see capped cells, you can let it ride and let them make their own queen, but it will be 30 days from the day you kill the queen before you see any new larvae. So it'll be 50 days before you see any, actual adult bees from that. So you may not want to wait that long. So on a full-blown hive that's midsummer, you can do that. But if your package or new hive, you kill the queen, it's probably better off to just go buy a new one. Because you won't have enough bees to actually survive that process. And then, so if your queen is no longer fertile. So like that one case where we have all that spotty brood and they're filling it in with honey and the larvae aren't doing very well, you might see if you have a brood disease, but it might just be that the queen is not doing very well. And you need to find her and remove her and have, again, like a 48-hour waiting period. Because while the bees tend to favor a stronger queen over a weaker queen, the current queen is favored over any queen. So they'll actually have a weak queen and they'll kill the strong queen. And that's sort of Murphy's Law of expenditures too. The more expensive queen gets killed. But
Do you have sort of your own rule in terms of how often you like the queen to turn over, or you just watch and see how the hive's doing? If it's doing
I usually do it, I watch them because there's plenty of queens that do 2 or 3 years just fine. And then there's other queens that weren't worth anything when you got them, and you can replace them in a couple of months and it's no big deal. The key is you can get good quality queens in, April, May, and June, but in July, not so much. In August, forget it. As people are selling queens in August, maybe from some commercial guy in California, but not from around here. Because just the mating isn't good. There's not enough out there. You need about, I think the rule of thumb is they want 100 drone producing hives for every 100 mated queens. So if you got some backyard guy who's making queens with 4 hives, he's depending on the local hives, and that may or may not be enough to actually get a good mating. They'll lay eggs really good for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then fail. So balancing populations right now, you're just trying to get maximum population. So the things you can do to do that are the pollen patties and the feeding are, one, it just gives them stuff. They can get that forage stuff from out in the field, but what it does is it stimulates the workers to get the queen to make more eggs. Okay, so it's not even just the power, it's a signal. Oh man, the rush is on, we can start making larvae. But with this kind of cold and rainy stuff, if they're just going on the native forage, it's sort of spotty and they'll hold off. So the buildup will actually be much less. So the pollen patties and the feed are actually to stimulate breeding as much as to give them the actual energy. If your queen is producing patchy brood all over, you might want to send me some pictures or ask, is this a decent brood pattern? Because it might be worth considering getting a new queen in June or something like that. It sort of depends on if they're actually producing adult bees. When you start to see your first emerging adults is when you can kind of breathe a little bit easier. But if you see that there's just a spotty here and there, adult emerging, it might be time to requeen. This is where it helps if you have 2 hives. You can look at one hive that's totally rocking and the other one isn't. You can requeen the one that's not and then grab one frame of brood from the good hive and put it in the bad hive, and it'll kind of give them the kickstart they need to kind of keep going. Because if you requeen, probably within the next week or 2, you could probably go on the bees that you have. But if you wait a month, I think what will happen is your population is too small to kind of support a new queen, unless you supply some kind of outside brood. And then keep an eye out for laying workers. So this is the time of year when new beekeepers kill their queen, and you may not notice it right away. So, because if you can't see eggs, the larvae are uncapped for about 6 days, and then all of a sudden you don't see any more larvae, and now you're almost 12 days into the death of your queen. It's time to get a new queen. So next time I'm going to talk about brood disease, kind of the plague of bees, American fall brood. European fall brood is actually a lot more common, but it's not quite the end of the world. You can actually cure that. Chalk brood is more common when it's wet like this. Or if you have a lot of sprinklers around your hive, you'll see the bees seem to dry up and turn into these little chalk-like nuggets. And it's basically a fungus that actually grows on the bees. Dysentery, nosema, that's actually really common in spring. As it gets drier, it's not as much of a common. And then varroa, we always talk about varroa because that's kind of the main thing you can worry about. But anyway.
How often are you inspecting your hive? You make it sound like you're in there all the time.
Well,
I don't feel like I
your
can
first
do it.
month, I would go in there every week, for sure. And I always tell people, install your package, let them sit for 4 or 5 days if you can stand it. Then look at them every weekend until you start to see, you put on that second box.
Yeah.
So when the second box is on there, then you can lay back and do them every other week. And if your hive is established, you could do it once a month. So like, you know, in April, I inspect them every week. In May, I inspect them twice. In June, I inspect them once. In July, I inspect them once. In August, I'll inspect them 4 times. September, I'll inspect them 4 times. You know, October, once or twice. And then maybe not even in November. That's kind of how I look at it. There's kind of the high season and the low season. Unless you see a problem, like if your queen is failing or you just put in a new queen, kind of reset the cycle and look at them every week. Most things happen in about a week, you know, so like producing queen cells. So early on in swarm season, you want to be looking at them more than every 7 days so you don't miss swarm cells. But once swarm season has passed a little bit, you know you got a feel for where your hive is going. Every couple of weeks is fine. And you know, obviously, if you had 500 hives, you're not going to look at them every week. But
When is swarm season?
it probably starts in late March and goes all the way till middle of June. So it'll be wrapping up in about 6 weeks, 5-6 weeks. And a lot of times, just like you look at that Facebook page and you can see what people are seeing. Oh, my hive swarmed. You know, when you quit hearing about that, that's when it's over. Because it is a little bit seasonal. Like right now, there's no swarms going on, but I bet you if people looked in their hives, which they're not because it's raining, they would discover there's queens. So I'll do inspections on a hive, and it's like we'll see 2 queens. And I'm like, well, I recommend a split like right now, because if we put this back together the first warm day, they're gone. And I always tell people, if it's over 50 but raining, we can still go inspect them. It's not the end of the world. They're a little bit more ornery. They definitely don't prefer that. But if there's a break in the weather and you need to look at them, it's not the end of the world.
And then smoking. When do you use smoke and when do you not use smoke?
If I'm looking for the queen and there was some kind of problem, it's pretty invasive. I would use some smoke. If you're just kind of opening it up until you see the first eggs, I don't bother to use smoke. Especially this time.
Does that really slow them down or mess them up? Because I used to always
It totally
smoke.
resets the hive for about 2 days. Yeah. So I recommend not using smoke if you don't feel the need for it. And if you do, just up the entrance once, pull the lid up the top once, set it aside, and forget about it. And then if the bees start getting cranky on you, maybe give them one more puff. But a lot of people are like, if you're going to look through every single frame to find the one queen and pull her out or something, it's worth kind of smoking them up because then they all kind of hunker down. But you're almost never doing that. And actually, when you do that, then that queen will hide. So you're better off just working through it. Unless your hive is really aggressive, you can work on it without smoke. Wow, this is like hard to talk over.
You gotta keep talking, at least until it stops.
Oh, you did? Okay. Okay, well, not everybody's hive is that nice then, yeah. So if they may be getting robbed then. So if the bees are aggressive, especially just on first, he just slides the hive lid off to feed them, and then he got stung, they're getting robbed, almost for sure. So it might be a good idea to kind of check to make sure that, yeah. There might be, was there a way to get in on the top? Okay. Yeah, that would be my guess. It could be they're just ornery bees, so. What? So he wants to know what kind of foundation to use for honey supers. And most people use some kind of plastic foundation because it holds up better in the extractor. The other way to go is use no foundation and then they draw just pure honeycomb And then you can make cut comb, which is really sought after. People really, really like that. The key is probably go with one or the other, because they tend to favor one over the other. And if you only give them one choice, they'll go with it. So like if you put foundation, empty frame, foundation, empty frame, they'll go with one of those. And then you'll know at least what their preference is. But a lot of them actually, they draw a comb just fine on an empty frame. It's just the wooden part of the frame without the foundation.
With the empty frame, would you recommend putting wire to help them back into a straight line?
Well, the wire, so people will put wire reinforcing in. That's mostly just for reinforcing, not, it doesn't really guide them so much. They'll actually just use gravity. So that's the reason why I always say level your hive. I had this guy with all of his combs, the frames are going like this, but the gravity was this way and his comb were all sideways. But they'll use gravity as a guide. If your hive's level, that's probably good enough. The problem is if you want to extract them in a extractor, they'll probably blow out if they don't have wires or some kind of foundation. You have to be real careful. That's why people went to foundation really for that.
I have a couple of questions about feeding. I've got two packages that I just installed. I've got a high top feeder that I'm putting syrup in. I haven't been putting the pollen patty. Should I add that?
Yeah, the pollen patty, like I said, it stimulates the workers to trigger more brood. And so put that down on top of the frames, not up in the
Is that something you can buy like here, or do you have to make that?
yeah, you can just buy it. It's soy flour mixed with a little bit of sugar water and essential oils. And the essential oils are kind of nice because it keeps it from molding. So if you make it yourself, it'll get all moldy. And that's what the oils do to prevent.
So related to that, someone said that the high top feeders can be a problem because the sugar will ferment.
Yeah.
How do you?
So the supplements that they sell for liquid feed are mainly designed to prevent fermentation.
So I was putting lemongrass and spearmint
Yeah,
in there and a little bit of leptin.
Yeah, that should probably do it. The other thing you can do if you're cheap like me is a teaspoonful of vinegar per gallon of feed. But the vinegar it loses its effectiveness over a week or two. So if they're eating it real fast, that'll be good. But if it goes a month, the vinegar eventually degrades and doesn't do it as much. But that's what the supplements are mainly for, is to prevent yeast from fermenting it. Because otherwise they're going there. Somebody just called me before this, and I think he had drunk bees. They were eating the bee feed, and then the alcohol, rather than making them drunk, it actually kills them. And you'll see all these bees kind of laying down in front of the hive, all shaky and staggering, and then they eventually die. Because it essentially just dissolves their insides. And you don't realize it. It looks like some kind of poisoning. And you open up the feeder and it'll be all foamy. That's some kind of yeast has gotten in there. Alcohol is not so good for bees. Yeah.
So does the pollen expire or spoil? Because I had a frame last year, and I think it got robbed. But there's a bunch of pollen left over, and so I put that in my. Is that bad?
No, so the pollen actually seems to last for years. So they put a little layer of honey over the top of it, and it will last for years. It'll stay fresh. The pollen patty stuff, when I've tried to reuse it like the next year, the bees don't seem to like it. I don't know if it's spoiled or they're just not digging it. So I don't buy too much of that. Those tubs they sell are probably good enough for probably 5 or 6 hives. You might be able to, you have 2 or 3 hives, get a tub and then use it in the spring and in the fall, but it's way too much. They should sell about half that much. So if you just have 1 or 2 hives, split it with somebody because it'll just go to waste. Cool, nobody's anxious to run out the door into the rain.
So, I have a new package, it's in my little box. So when I'm after the first 21 days, what should I expect, as far as filling that first box? When should I be putting on the second box, or, because I'm
Well, so the rule of thumb that people, to add the second box, you ought to have at least 6 frames drawn on both sides. Some people say 7.
Filled, drawn out, but maybe not filled with
Yeah, drawn out is fine. Bill,